All right. So again, I welcome everyone for being with us this evening. This is our kickoff of the MidCoast Audubon Talk series that we have every fall and winter. We normally do it at the Camden Public Library in the Picker Room. And of course, because of COVID-19, we've had to get creative. So we'll be doing them online this season. So I encourage you to please check the MidCoast Audubon website as well as the Camden Public Library's website for all the latest information on the various talks that we'll be hosting over the next season. I'm going to read you a little bit about the MidCoast Audubon in case you're unfamiliar with them before we begin our talk. MidCoast Audubon is a chapter and affiliated with Maine Audubon. They cover the Midcoast inland from Boothbay Harbor west to Windsor and China and east along the coast to Bucksport. Their mission is to promote long-term responsible use of natural resources through informed membership, education, and community awareness. Throughout the year, fascinating and informative programs are presented for free, which we all love, via the Camden Public Library, and there are numerous field trips to see birds and learn about the natural history of Maine. Come on and be part of the fun and learning. You can visit their calendar of events for more information. And their website is midcoast.maineaudubon.org. And I'll put that in the chat box later so that everyone can write that down and go ahead and visit them. All right, so this evening's presenter, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Jeff Wells. Dr. Wells is one of the nation's leading bird experts, a conservation biologist focusing on protection of Canada's boreal forest region and author of Birders Conservation Handbook. He was part author of the team of the forthcoming book, Birds of Maine, that was a project of well-known Maine ornithologist, the late Peter Vickery. Jeff and his wife, Allison Childs Wells, author of the weekly column, A Bird's Tale, in the Boothbay Register and Wiscasset newspaper. Jeff and Allison are co-authors of the books Maine's Favorite Birds and Birds of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. So again, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jeff Wells to be here with us tonight and tell us about this important topic of climate change and the decline of birds and what can be done. Jeff, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here. First of all, just can everybody hear me? Just maybe put your finger up if you can, or wave so I know.
Yes, okay. We can hear you well.
It's a pleasure to be able to kick off this series, and the group there at the library and with MidCoast Audubon are super folks, and I know I've actually had the pleasure of speaking there in the past before, and I know what a great environment it is at the library. So. You know, I'm sorry that we can't be all together in that spot, but it's nice that we at least have this opportunity to be together virtually through the miracle of Zoom technology. I'm going to try to do my share screen now so I can show you the slideshow. Okay, is that working? Can everybody see a slide there?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I know this isn't exactly the title that maybe we had in the publicity, but this is kind of the working title I'm at now. You know, to talk about both the tough stuff that's happening to birds and bird populations in the environment, but also the good news that we need to be aware of and start, you know, using as we started to try to find solutions to these issues that we keep hearing about in the news. I want to highlight before we completely start here this book, The Birds of Maine, that Julia mentioned, that I was honored to be part of the author team to finish. Peter Vickery was a great friend of mine, and many of you probably knew him, and his life work was working on this book, but he sadly wasn't able to finish it before he passed away a number of years ago. And so a number of us, he asked us before he passed away if we'd help to move it forward, working with his wife Barbara and Scott Weidensaul, a well-known author many of you may know as well. And so this book is just about ready to come out. It's going to be coming out by November, and it's already advertised on the Princeton University Press website and probably others. But it's going to be just a pretty monumental book, and it's going to have a lot about both the the status of birds and the history of birds and ornithology in Maine, but also on the conservation of birds. And many of the things I'm talking about today related to Maine will be in that book. So I just urge all of you to think about getting a copy of that when it comes out. You won't be disappointed. I just want to start off just thinking about our beautiful state here and what makes it so special. Maine, none of us have to be told this, but Maine is a very special place for birds. Over 400 species. We have our kind of north woods specialties that people from far away sometimes come to see. Our lakes and rivers, the sea and shorelines, and of course the migration spectacle that happens every spring and fall here. One of the most iconic of the birds, and I'm going to see if I can just play a little sound. Not that all of us know what a loon sounds like, but still, I hope none of us tire of listening to that sound. I'm going to just try to play it on my. I hope that came through. I think most of us probably have a memory of maybe the first time we ever heard a loon. Sleeping in a tent near a lake, maybe, or in a camp porch or something like that. I know I remember as a kid, the first time I got to stay at the family camp over in Parker Pond, north of Kent's Hill there, and hearing the loon for the first time and leaping out of bed, probably at 4 years old or something, and running and scared to my parents, wondering what it was. But I was fortunate enough to just be out at that same, not that same camp, but a camp near that area in Parker Pond again this summer, and just spend time at night listening to that beautiful sound of the loons. It's such a part of what we think of as an iconic Maine experience and bird. This one here as well, sometimes people don't know that the bird making the sound I'm about to play is the white-throated sparrow. Old Sam Peabody, 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 or as my friends in Canada say, oh sweet Canada, Canada, Canada. I'll play it one more time. Just a classic sound of summer in Maine through many parts of the state, even if people don't know what the bird is. And then we have some other birds that are not ones you normally see in your backyard. Special kind of mysterious birds like the Biechens thrush, found only in the very high mountaintops above 3,500 feet of New England and parts of New York and southeastern Canada. So this is a very special bird people come to see, to climb up a mountain, to be there at dawn, to try to hear and see this special bird that migrates down into the Greater Antilles of the Caribbean, to the mountains in those regions to spend the winter. And of course, these are spring warblers, but we're getting all the fall warblers passing through right now. But this kind of these sort of riches of warblers that we have in Maine, not just in migration. Most of these, all the ones in this picture here, nest in Maine. But we just have a huge number of these beautiful gems of the bird world here that make it so special, including this bird here, the Blackburnian warbler. Usually you don't see them this well. They're usually up on the very top of the tall spruces along the coast and inland. Very high-pitched sound. And most people don't know that Maine is one of the most significant areas supporting Blackburnian warblers. We have an estimated 15% of the global population nesting right in our state. Another bird that we have significant responsibility for is the black-throated blue warbler, a denizen of the magnificent beech forests of Maine in particular. Has this wonderful buzzy song, Zur 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 Zri, or I'm So Lazy, that you hear kind of ringing from all those forests. And we have nearly 20% of the whole world's population nesting in Maine. This is another bird, by the way, that goes to winter in the Greater Antilles, like the Biechens thrush. And of course, we have our beautiful coasts and all the birds that are found there. How many of us have like a special osprey or eagle nest that we watch carefully through the year to see when they start nesting, or in the case of the ospreys, when they return, and how the young are doing, and when they leave. And birds like the puffin. For us, we usually take at least one annual summer trip on the Hardy boat out of New Harbor near in the Pemaquid area out to Eastern Egg Rock to see the restored puffin population there. But such a classic Maine bird, and of course now with boat trips like the Hardy boat and trips in Boothbay Harbor and all up and down the coast, there's a whole economy thriving from people coming to see and watch puffins. Now, we talked about some of the things that make Maine special, but not all is well in the bird world, the biodiversity world. Maybe some of you have seen just in the past week a whole set of reports that have come out. The UN just had a report on how well countries have done in trying to reach the biodiversity goals, and there's been a whole set of reports on the state of things in biodiversity conservation, and it's not good news. We know the extinction rate. These graphs here talk about the background extinction rate and where it is, and you can see it's way above what the kind of background would be without all the changes that we've imposed on the earth. In some cases, it's as much as 1,000 times higher than it used to be, or it was historically. We heard about, over the last couple of years, multiple news stories on the kind of global decline of insects, very alarming declines. And of course, one of the most alarming was the report that came out just last year that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology was part of. Almost 3 billion birds less than we had back in 1970, right here in North America. I mean, a massive drop in numbers. And that's, across all sorts of birds, forest birds, shorebirds, grassland birds. And even if you get down to particular species, the numbers lost are pretty astounding. Many of these on this list you can see are birds of grasslands like meadowlark, eastern meadowlark, and to some degree northern bobwhite. Also, insect-eating birds have shown major declines, like the bank swallow, and actually all of the swallows have had major declines, including here in Maine. Even familiar birds like the dark-eyed junco and the red-winged blackbird that we think of as very common, but they've shown massive declines in abundance. And in fact, right here in Maine, if you look at the most recent reviews of species in Maine and their conservation status, about 40% of Maine's birds are in some kind of conservation concern list. The reasons for these problems are pretty well known. They haven't really changed too much. Of course, the biggest one, habitat destruction and degradation, exotic species pollution, invasive species, and so forth. I don't even have climate change on this particular graph because that's sort of an overarching cause of problems. But we know for the most part what most of the problems are. Some of the species we're still trying to pinpoint exactly where the problem is, but we know the broad picture of what is causing that those declines. Now, in a place like Maine, the history of the land use and landscape can be make it a little bit more nuanced. This is a graph that shows how much farmland that we had back starting in the mid-1800s, the number of farms, and the line above it is the percent of the state in farmlands. And you can see, back in those 1800s and early 1900s, we had as much as 30% of the entire state in farmlands. And then over time, as wars and the Great Depression and all sorts of other things changed, mechanized farming and different things like that lowered the number of farms, and has been a very huge decline in the percent of the state in farmland, and that of course has had a change, has caused a change in in grassland bird populations that use hay fields and things like that, meadowlarks and bobolinks and all of those sorts of birds. And forest land has actually increased as farms have abandoned. So we've had sort of a flip of what the total land cover looks like. But in the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen the landscape change yet again. And in southern Maine and in parts of the agricultural part of Aroostook County, we see a major expansion and loss of habitat from just urban and suburban development. And probably all of us have a story, if we've been here very long, of a place we knew that is now turned into some kind of a development or something like that. The very first place I ever saw upland sandpipers, a grassland dependent bird, was in the grasslands on the northern edge of Bangor. That's where I went to high school. Those vast grasslands, hayfields that used to be there, are now the site of the Bangor Mall and all the mini malls and big box stores. And there are definitely no upland sandpipers there anymore. And most of us have stories and memories of the kind of change that's happening, and it's predicted to just continue to happen. As I've said, some of the biggest declining birds across the whole country, and including here in Maine, are birds like the bobolink, up here in the left corner, but also birds of shrublands, birds like the American woodcock, that like kind of shrubby edges and alder swales and things like that. And that kind of habitat is also part of the habitat that we're losing now. Our Gulf of Maine, we know, is under incredible stress. It's been impacted over the years from all sorts of issues related to pollution and overfishing in the past, and now from climate change and just some huge impacts. Audubon just released a report about a year ago that looked at the impacts of climate change on 389 birds that occur in the United States and Canada, and actually modeled what we would expect to have happen to those birds over time, and basically looked at a scenario of, okay, what will happen if we don't do anything at all, and what will happen if we actually lower the greenhouse gas emissions, sort of worst case and best case, and sort of a middle scenario, just to see what we would think would happen, and what we expect to see. And there's lots of maps like this on the Audubon website that you can actually see the results of that modeling work and see what birds are predicted to change. You can actually put your zip code in and see what birds will change, what birds will start showing up, what birds will start disappearing from your area. This is the Canada warbler, I think, and it just shows how the birds are going to be pushed further and further north, and eventually will disappear from some of the places down here. Some of our most familiar birds will eventually, if this continues without us doing something to stop it, will disappear from our state. One of the other impacts of sea level rise of climate change is sea level rise. I'm sure all of you have heard stories about that. This is a map that the Natural Resources Council of Maine produced that shows the changes in a beloved place, Reed State Park, and how much of those beautiful beaches and even the facilities will be underwater under different scenarios of sea level rise. That's the sort of impact on the human visibility of the place. But what about the birds? Well, it turns out that for some of these birds, that very narrow edge of just sort of a few feet between low tide and high tide is their whole range of existence. The salt marsh sharp-tailed sparrow is one example. It only occurs just in that very tiny, narrow salt marsh along the coast. That's the only place it has to survive in. It only uses that habitat. So just a slight change in sea level will have a massive effect. And it's a bird that people are very worried about how they will do. Their nests already, if there's an exceptionally high tide or a storm that pushes water into a salt marsh, can just destroy all the nests, because the nests are just barely above the normal high tide mark, and just a little extra water coming in there will destroy an entire nesting season for them. So if you have that repeatedly happen, this is going to be very tough for that species to survive. And there's a whole suite of birds that have a similar situation. So I've told you a few of the bad news stories, and I'm sorry to kind of pile that onto your shoulders with everything else going on, but we have to be honest about the reality of it. But the other part of the reality of it is that history shows that we can actually fix these problems. And I'm going to show you some examples. That's a part that should give us hope. At the turn of the century, we had uncontrolled commercial hunting for birds. Some of it was to decorate women's hats, the millinery trade, and just millions and millions of birds were killed to get the feathers, and even sometimes whole birds stuck on hats. Some of it was to sell in the markets. This is a market price list, and you can see on here a lot of waterfowl, but if you look at the bottom, you'll see at the very bottom it says reed birds, $1 a dozen. Reed birds are bobolinks. Bobolinks being sold in the market, and things like blackbirds and yellowlegs, a shorebird, or curlew, that may have referred to the Eskimo curlew, which is of course now extinct from excessive market hunting. So this was the problem that we had at that time. What happened? Well, Audubon societies formed. That's how the whole Audubon movement came about. They formed. They hired wardens right here in Maine. The very first wardens ever hired. It was the start of the idea of game wardens. Partly came from Audubon getting these wardens, often the lighthouse keepers themselves at some of these islands, hired to protect the birds before it became kind of a state agency thing to have game wardens. And eventually all that work banned the interstate commerce in bird feathers and stopped all of this, and led to the signing of the Migratory Bird Treaty, which regulated the hunting of basically all migratory birds. And we saw all these birds come back. There's so many stories: eiders bouncing back, and gulls and terns and egrets and herons and seabirds of all sorts. It was a great success story. We have the success stories related to the Endangered Species Act. All the work that went into bringing back eagles that now we see all over the place, and peregrine falcons and brown pelicans and wood storks, all of these birds that were kind of on the verge of extinction, and the Endangered Species Act brought attention to them. Groups like Audubon and other nonprofits became engaged in doing the work on the ground and advocating for more funding for these programs, and we saw great success. So, another one of the great successes. One of the greatest of the success stories of the Endangered Species Act is the piping plover. We've doubled or almost tripled populations of piping plovers since about 1980 overall, certainly on the Atlantic coast. And right here in Maine, the numbers have gone from 20 in 1981 to just this past year. I don't know if you saw in the news, something, I think 87 pairs, 174 individual piping plovers in Maine. And, I just remember in my kind of college years working for Maine Audubon, struggling to keep a piping plover alive, a nest going on Goose Rocks Beach in southern Maine. And then, just a year or two being down on Goose Rocks Beach and seeing, I think, 16 or 18 piping plovers just all walking around on the beach one day in late July. And just, astounding to see a success story like that. So we know we can do it if we want to. How about the success story of the wild turkey? Gone from Maine by about 1840 or 1850, completely gone from the state. And then through a series of introduction efforts that started sort of in New York to Vermont, Vermont to Maine. Now we have turkeys that people are complaining about because they're all over their backyards and porches. But to go from completely gone to being a common bird that we see everywhere just an amazing success story. If you look at land protection as a way to measure our success here in Maine, you know, we've seen some amazing changes. The map on the left, I can't quite remember the date, but a few decades ago, and then a map on the right showing the additional conservation lands, some of them very large, especially in northern Maine and eastern Maine, of course, that have been added just in the last couple of decades. So some, you know, great success there as far as increased land protection that helps birds and all sorts of other wildlife. You know, our river restoration work here in Maine, this graphic here talks about the removal of the Edwards Dam in Augusta that happened in 1999. I don't know if any of you have been up along the Kennebec much, but, you know, now you see it teeming with bald eagles and ospreys, and you know, there's, you know, more than 5 million alewives that come up it now, and, you know, this thriving ecosystem coming back. And the same thing's now happening in the Penobscot River and in all sorts of smaller rivers where people are coming together and working on restoration efforts that are bringing back the entire ecosystem and the fish, the birds, the insects, all of it together. And we're just seeing this incredible rebounds in these populations. So there are solutions, and that's the good news part of this. You know, we keep hearing the bad news, but we know there are solutions. It's just going to take us kind of scaling up the solutions to meet the need. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing to try to scale up some of the solutions to protect the birds of the boreal forest, which are the birds that are flooding through in migration here in Maine right now and every spring and fall and spend much of the winter here. The boreal forest is the forest north of us that stretches from Alaska across to Newfoundland. And it's part of one of the last large intact forests in the world. This is a recreation of the original forests 8,000 years ago, before any of them were, of course, ever sort of, you know, cut over by large-scale industry. And this is a map showing the forests that remain on Earth that have not been cut over by large-scale forest industry or mining or anything like that, that are still ecologically intact. And, you know, these represent the last places in the course of human history on this Earth that we could still get conservation right. You know, these places are still intact, many of them roadless, without large-scale forestry or mining or hydro or any of those things. And so we have a chance to think about how we could maintain them and protect them and protect what's there. The boreal forest has about, in Canada, Canada and Alaska has about 25% of these remaining intact forests. It's about 1.5 billion acres in area, and again, stretching from Alaska across Canada, sandwiched between the Arctic and the prairies in the west, and then between kind of Hudson James Bay and the eastern forests that we're familiar with in the east, and all the way to Newfoundland and Labrador. The boreal is one of the last places on Earth that still has healthy populations of large mammals and predators like caribou and wolves and bears, grizzly bears, black bears, polar bears even in parts of it. It holds more fresh water than any other place on Earth. It has some of the world's largest lakes. Something like 2 or 3 of the world's 10 largest lakes are in the boreal. Some of the longest undammed rivers certainly in North America. And it has incredible numbers of birds, about 400 species that occur there of all types, from sort of sparrows to shorebirds like the yellowlegs to grouse and ptarmigan and warblers and thrushes. 276 species that have more than 5% of their breeding range, blackbirds, ducks, everything you can imagine. And we did some modeling work and discovered that across the boreal forest there are between 1 and 3 billion with a B, birds that breed in the boreal forest every summer. There's about almost 100 species that have half of their entire world population nesting just within that region. So an incredible responsibility for maintaining those populations. In the fall, when you add the young of the year, there are 3 to 5 billion birds that come spilling out of the boreal forest because it's a cold place and most of the birds leave there. And that means that in the height of migration, and this has been confirmed by work through Cornell and others with Birdcast and some other radar ornithology work, that there are literally hundreds of millions of these boreal birds aloft in the skies at night migrating south in the fall. Each night there's a sea of these birds heading south. Most of these birds do most of their migration at night and then stop during the day to feed and rest. So the birds that we're seeing each day right here in Maine are this part of the sea of boreal birds that are flooding south on their way, sometimes to places as far south as South America. So the boreal is one of these last great conservation opportunities on Earth, but it's also seen by some as one of the last great opportunities for natural resource extraction, for industry, for making money through some of these processes. And so the less than 12% is protected currently, and the pressures are mounting for all of these different sorts of things. You could look at some of the birds that we know well, like the evening grosbeak here, a bird that many people will remember back in the 80s, used to just flood people's feeders in the winter. It's now declined by about 80%, or maybe even a little bit more. And if you look at its range in the boreal forest, that's the part in kind of orange yellow in this map, and you overlay it with in red is the area where there's been forestry cutting, roads, mining, all of those sorts of things in the southern part of the boreal. You can see there's a strong overlap between the evening grosbeak's range and these impacts. And while it's not a cause and effect, it does make us think that that is part of the reason why we're seeing this decline. And there's a set of species for which this is true, that have their sort of southern boreal specialists that have a great overlap with this, and there's some of the ones that are declining the most. Outside of the bird world, the woodland caribou is another example. Sometimes people don't remember that we had woodland caribou in Maine until something around 1912 or something like that. We have caribou mountains and caribou bogs and caribou lakes, and of course we have the town of Caribou, all named because we had caribou here until that time. And people hunted them right up until even into the very early 1900s. They were still taking them. The red in this map here is the area where woodland caribou used to occur up until the late 1800s, early 1900s, and where they've disappeared from, and they're sort of being pushed further and further north. And actually they're an endangered species in Canada, and there's a lot of work going on to try to figure out how to save them. One of the good news parts of the boreal forest story, though, is that a set of progressive visionaries came together from nonprofit conservation organizations and Indigenous leaders from Indigenous governments, as well as some progressive industry, maybe about 20 years ago, and they came up with a vision of what could be done to maintain all those special values of the boreal forest. And they proposed that at least 50% of that boreal forest should be put into strict protected areas, and whatever areas were not strictly protected should be developed only with the most leading edge sustainable development practices. Some might say, well, 50% doesn't seem like enough, and maybe it isn't. But at the time, that was way above what anyone ever imagined. The global recommendation was 10%. So, this was so far above it, many people scoffed at the idea even. We see the global benchmarks sort of increasing as science is showing that we need to have more and more areas protected if we want to maintain all the special plants and animals and ecological services like clean air and clean water and carbon sequestration we're going to have a much larger area protected. But this was pretty visionary back then, and it spurred on some incredible conservation. And what happened over these last 20 years, roughly, is that we saw the largest land conservation gains and effort, really, in the world happening in the boreal forest. But over 180 million acres of new protected areas established since 2000. That's the kind of stuff that was happening in the kind of Teddy Roosevelt years that we read, we watch on TV in like the National Park series. We haven't seen anything like that, certainly in North America since then. So this is pretty astounding stuff. It's kind of one of conservation's best kept secrets. You think this is something like 6 times the state of Maine that has been protected in new protected areas since 2000. And it's only been possible because of some amazing indigenous leadership. In the last 20 years, there has been a rise in the acknowledgement and a legal acknowledgement through Canada's Supreme Court that Indigenous people, Indigenous governments actually do have a right to say what is going to happen to their land. And they've taken on their responsibility and to do that, and done a lot of incredible work, land use planning, sophisticated mapping, as well as bringing in their elders and looking at traditional knowledge about these places. And it's through their work that we've seen this incredible success. And that's bodes well for the future, because we know actually that there's at least another, just recently, at least another 100 million acres that is being proposed by Indigenous governments across Canada. And that's one of our big projects with Audubon in our Boreal program, is how do we come along as allies to help support and move those acres forward to get complete protection. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're working on, coming alongside these Indigenous governments and leaders to be with them and listen to them to find ways to make this conservation keep happening, the biggest conservation on the planet. I like to put this little statement in here. It's so simple, but when we're coming up on elections, I just feel like we just have to keep remembering, we actually have the right to say what we want for our future. We don't have to leave it in someone else's hands. Let's just get out there and say what we want. Do we want more birds, more protected areas, cleaner air, cleaner water? Let's say it and think about how to get there. Who are the leaders that want that, and let's support them and push for the future that we really want. That's what this is all about, really. If we want to find ways to help the birds and help biodiversity. I always like to make it a little bit simpler. Sometimes, you can feel overwhelmed. You get a barrage of mailings and items on the news and emails about what needs to be done and all the emergencies, and try to put it into some simple categories. The first one I have on there, save the last of the large and restore the remnants of the rare. The work that I talk about doing in the Boreal, can be scaled to wherever you live. And that's a lot of what land trusts do, and what things like the Land for Maine Futures Bond is all about, and other nonprofits that are working to protect land. Finding ways to help them and support them. If they're doing restoration work, whether that's helping by being a member or by getting out there with a shovel and planting trees, find ways to do that. The other ones on this are pretty clear, I think. Supporting the conservation organizations in your area, bringing more people on. That's what Audubon chapters like MidCoast Audubon does with its education programs, getting more and more people enthused, bringing them in on this renaissance of bird conservation. We have more people working on bird conservation than ever before, even though we don't always feel like it. And then finally, in this election time, weighing in on policy decisions and voting for family-friendly conservation ideals. you know, another way to make it a little less overwhelming and to kind of keep the pace going to do good conservation is something I call the 1 in 3. You know, maybe pick something that you're doing that you want to do on a weekly basis, monthly basis. I don't know what it is. You pick the time schedule, but try to do one thing in your own home, whether it has to do with recycling or changing your light bulbs. I don't know what it might be. Something in your local community, and something at the national and global community level, which is made easy by so many of the organizations that, you know, send you those emails so you can click on them and send a letter to a congressperson or something like that. You know, some of the local organizations that you can support to make some of these things happen. You know, you see things like the Coastal Mountains Land Trust. You guys, of course, are very aware of that. The Natural Resources Council of Maine here in the state level, supporting their work in all sorts of ways. You know, this is from their website from a little while ago, but you can find out more. You can get involved in all sorts of ways. My wife Allison's the senior director of public affairs there, and I know what a great organization they are on the front lines of trying to take care of our environment. And of course, I work for the National Audubon Society, and we have a lot of great programs and content. I'm proud of the fact that, you know, right up at the top of the page, you'll see that Take Action button. And that's one of the things that anytime you go to the website or get involved, there'll be an opportunity to actually be involved in doing something to help birds in different ways. Lots of information about some of the different pressing issues that are happening at any particular time that you can get involved in to help try to change policies or to help support legislation. We have our own Boreal forest part of the website that talks about what's happening in the Boreal forest and ways to get involved. And of course, you know, we would love to have any of you, if you're interested, become supporters and members. This is the website for Audubon and the website for the Boreal Conservation Program. And then if any of you happen to be Twitter maniacs, I've got a Twitter handle you can see here, and there's the Audubon Society and the Boreal Conserve Twitter. And if you're into that and you have a way to help amplify the messages about boreal conservation and other bird conservation messages by retweeting or commenting and sharing and that sort of thing in any of the social media realms, that's something that we find really helpful to try to get the message out. Of course, if any of you are in the mode of being philanthropic with large gifts for programs, I have to say, you know, I'm happy to talk with you more about that in supporting this work. And I'll point out at the bottom right of the screen, again, the Birds of Maine book, which has a whole serious look at conservation in Maine as part of it. That is something that I hope a lot of you will consider purchasing, and you'll probably be hearing more about that in various venues over the next year or two as we do presentations, the various author team parts of that, and you'll see some things about that, but something to watch for. I think I'll end there, and then happy to take questions if we have some time.
Yes, we definitely do have some time. And thank you so much, Jeff. That was very, very well put together and great information. I'm just going to jump right into these questions. The first one that came in says, would you comment at the end of this about the bird deaths in New Mexico this week?
Yeah, there's been some really horrible images coming from New Mexico of just, you know, birds, dozens and dozens of birds in any one place, just dead on the ground or dying, swallows and warblers and all sorts of birds. And it's not a part of the world where we see that sort of thing happening. Maybe some of you have been in places like even on, you know, the Maine Maine coast when there's sort of a fallout or something like that, and you've seen a little bit of that out on Monhegan Island or something, birds coming in exhausted and hopping around and that sort of thing. But a place like New Mexico is not a place where you see that, and so there's a lot of conjecture about what's going on. And the most recent that I've seen is that the thought is that a lot of these birds were either left early in their migration because of the massive fires, or were migrating already and pushed on to migrate further than they normally would because of the fires. Birds are very sensitive to smoke and their and air issues. So they probably would have had difficulty with the thick smoke if they were migrating or even on the ground there. So they think a lot of these birds were pushed to move through quickly, and they just are emaciated and exhausted, and so many of them are just dropping dead because of that. So it's another one of these things that we think is probably related to the fires, which are of course related to climate change, and just another one of the kind of gauntlet of problems and threats that these poor birds have to face as they migrate, and because of climate change. Just it's sad to see, but it's again something that should really make our resolve stronger for doing the things we need to do to work on climate change. Audubon has an entire climate change program. I don't know if most folks knew that at the national level. It does work both at trying to move states where there's a sort of a friendly government supportive of climate change initiatives in this particular federal government stance that we've been in recent years, where it's hard to do anything at the federal level, and at the same time building bipartisan support. We have an initiative that's called something like Climate Knows No Party or something like that, and trying to get bipartisan support. So when we have the right time to work on legislation at the national level and make some of the changes we need, we'll be more ready to go and try to get some things happening much more quickly.
Thank you. Gail has a question. She asks, is all the boreal land protected over the last 20 years formally protected in perpetuity so that none of it will be lost or developed in the future?
Yes, that's right. It's been moved into things like national parks, provincial parks, wildlife management units, and things like that. Different types of protection, but yes, moved into completely protected areas. And one of the exciting things that's happening now with the Indigenous movement across Canada is that these parks are becoming co-managed. The Indigenous communities and governments themselves are part of the management structure of the parks, and there's something called the Indigenous Guardians Program, or programs, which are being established across Canada, and we're trying to help get more of those established and get the federal government in Canada put more resources into supporting them, so that the people who live in these remote areas are the ones patrolling and doing the biological monitoring, all the kinds of things rangers do, but it's done by the Indigenous people in those areas who have a real strong stake in it. You're not sending somebody from far away to come and stay for a year or two and then leave. It's the people who live there and whose ancestors have been there for thousands of years, so they have a real strong stake in it. And what we actually find in most of these areas is that the Indigenous people and the Indigenous governments typically want to protect way more than 50%. They're more interested in protections that go up to 60, 70, 80, even sometimes 90% of areas, multi-million acre areas. And we just, even just last year, we had something called Fedene Nene that was established. It's a over 6 million acre park in the Northwest Territories. It's going to be co-managed with the Lutzelke Dene First Nation there, and we've got lots of examples of these over and over. It's really, just heartening to see the leadership that these Indigenous governments and people are taking.
Yes, I imagine, indigenous populations everywhere are always extremely sensitive to land loss issues and, how things affect the larger picture. So it is very reassuring to hear that they are taking a lot of efforts to have their voices heard about the issue. At this moment, I'd like to encourage anyone, if you have a question for Jeff, we have a few more minutes. You can go ahead and use the chat box feature to type in a question to him, and I will make sure that question gets to him. You can hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little toolbar pop up that says chat, or if you're on an iPad or a phone, you may have a couple little dots up in the corner. You can click on that. We have a comment that came in, and it's sort of a question too. It says, I heard on NPR that thousands of birds have died in the past months around the US and perhaps elsewhere. Terrible. When I heard the birds dying was down south with the storms we've been having, not just in New Mexico. Can you comment anything about how the impacts of the increased storms and hurricanes are impacting the birds in the south?
Yeah, hurricanes are famous for causing a lot of deaths of birds, songbirds that are in migration. I mentioned that most of these birds are migrating at night, and you can imagine a bird. Some of the birds actually, like the black-polled warbler, leave places like the Maine coast or the Maritimes, and they strike out over the ocean to fly sometimes 3 or 4 days nonstop before they're going to reach South America. And if they're doing that and they run into a hurricane, it's bad news for them. And there's lots of stories of ships out at sea that have had all these birds come raining down, half dead or dead, and islands in the Caribbean where thousands and thousands of birds will descend on the island, emaciated and dying. So this sort of thing does happen a lot when there's storms. Bigger birds are a little bit more able to withstand them, but big storms tend to kill a lot of birds as well. There's also an issue going on in California and parts of the West because of the drought, the same drought that's part of the reason we have the big fires, that has caused botulism outbreaks. And there's tens of thousands of birds that have been dying from botulism outbreaks in some of the national wildlife refuges in California. Really sad story. So yeah, I don't want to heap bad news, but there are a lot of things happening that make it really tough on birds. So, the more we can do to try to give them safe, healthy places to breed and survive, and places to stop over in migration, that are safe, the more we can help them. And of course, dealing with climate change because of these big picture things that are happening is going to be critical, because more storms and more fires is something it can only be changed by changing what we're, the amount of greenhouse gases, carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. So
it looks like Gail Presley, who is a representative here this evening from Maine, MidCoast Audubon, has put a link in the chat box if anyone is interested in reading about it. It has information about the Southwest facing unprecedented bird migratory deaths. So if anyone would like to read more about that, the link is available in the chat box. We have another question that says, could you please remind us again about the loss of 2.9 billion birds, and what was the time frame for that?
Yeah, that's the number of birds, fewer birds that we have now compared to 1970. So that's not through sort of one single event, but it's over the last 50 years, basically, and all of the sorts of things that have been impacting those birds over those years, just kind of a steady attrition, published in Science, obviously, the top, basically the top scientific journal, so very credible source about that. And there's breakdowns of what I showed one of the graphs that showed some of the individual species and how many fewer there were now than there were in 1970. So there's more information about it, but it's across the board in many ways. There are species, that are increasing, and I've mentioned some of them, like eagles and ospreys and turkeys and the work, the piping plovers that we've brought back, and pelicans, and and a lot of other birds here in Maine. There's a few warblers that are actually doing okay, like Blackthroated blue warbler, and pine warblers are sort of expanding north. And some of this is from also from climate change, where we see the populations moving up further north. And so you might see an increase in one part of the range and a decrease in another part where they're leaving. So a little bit more complicated when you're looking at the populations. But yeah, there's it's shocking, you know, when the news came out that there are that many fewer birds. It really, I hope, stirs people to say, okay, well, we got to step up and do a bit more, not just a bit more, a lot more than we have been doing.
Absolutely. This will be our last question. This is from David. He asks, can PV plants be a net plus for birds with proper plantings around the panels? Who is in charge of this sort of thing at Audubon?
So is that, I'm not sure what the, what do you mean by PV?
I'm not sure. David, could you expand upon that question? PV plants be a net plus for birds with proper plantings around the panels. Photovoltaic, solar.
Plants or, well, I mean, you know, solar is obviously definitely one of the solutions. Yeah, we need more solar. We just, you know, and we've had here in Maine, you know, I know groups like NRCM have been working on the front lines of trying to make it easier to have more solar, and, you know, struggling with some of the industries that don't want to be helpful there, or certain administrations that we had in the past that didn't want to be helpful. So, you know, yes, doing things like that to try to have renewable energy sources to lower our use on carbon intensive energy is definitely one of the solutions. You know, plantings, native plantings, the Audubon has a whole program, bird friendly backyards and native plantings, to try to encourage more and more people to be putting native plants in their yards, so that birds, when whether they're in migration or breeding in the area, have, you know, the right kinds of habitat and insects and things like that. You know, so that's sort of one of the at-home things people can do. And yeah, there's things, you know, there's things everybody can do, from the home to the local community to the national level, and we need to be all doing something in all those categories.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I wanted to also thank the MidCoast Audubon, which is, again, a chapter of Maine Audubon. I want to encourage you to visit their website. It's midcoast.maineaudubon.org. There's information on their website, and you may want to check out the membership information, because, as Jeff mentioned earlier, supporting organizations like this is tremendously important, and it's an excellent way to support their efforts and to help continue to spread the word about these very impactful issues. So again, midcoast.maineaudubon.org. I want to mention that next month in October, the MidCoast Audubon program is going to be featuring Don Reamer. If you are local and you read the Free Press, you might be familiar with his birding articles. And his topic is going to be exploring summering with the vultures. So he apparently monitored a family of turkey vultures as soon as they were hatched and off into their fledgling away in independence. So I think that's something to really look forward to, and please join us for. The date for that program is Thursday, October 15th at 6 p.m. And you can email me and I will happily send you a Zoom link to participate in that program as well. You can find out information about this program and others on the librarycamden.org website, or of course the MidCoast Maine Audubon website. If you enjoyed this program and want to share it with your friends, I will be posting it by tomorrow morning on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube page. Jeff, thank you so much. This was tremendous, very important information again. And we've had a number of comments coming in also mentioning that they appreciated the presentation. So with that, I wish everyone a wonderful evening, and definitely check out the book, Birds of Maine. We'll be trying to get a copy of it for the library, and we encourage you to buy one as well. Take care. Good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.